Hello, uh, my name is Brian Bowen. Welcome to my channel, and welcome to my debate review, part 8 of I've done with debate review I've done with a debate I've done with Anuj Agarwal from India. I had this debate with him for about 2 weeks, 220 posts. I've been going over it for the past few days. Second day, eight uh, eight parts that I've had on this. Okay. All right. But I'm almost done. We're in his last rebuttals. Hopefully this video won't be too long. All right. Say, part 2. Which part of the hadith is supposed to be a reply to my point? At best, you are arguing a lot of Quran, may be lost, and Muslims might not have been able to piece it together. Cool, let's agree with that. What makes my point wrong? Lots of things. You're not understanding Islamic history. Quran is not based on eyewitness testimony, just verses that are being told, stories. Part 3, it's like he's just being quick with these other parts. Or this will be a short video. Part 3 already reply to the first paragraph. And if your point is Christians truly believe that Christ raised from the dead, then we are in agreement. In that same way, Baba supports truly believes him to be a miracle worker, and Baba Falls thinks him a miracle doer as well. What I do is Jesus rising again from the dead. Because none of these guys ever claim to be, in fact, no founder of any world religion outside of Christianity has ever been claimed by its earliest followers to risen from the dead. Christianity is the only one, any world religion. And this is incredible because Muhammad doesn't either say that. So I don't see the similarity here. Part 4 is basically rehash of other parts which I already replied to. You're basically repeating the assertion that Quran was story dictated by Muhammad to his followers. Where did these followers come from? Did they magically appear when Muhammad started telling a story? Oh, we said they did. What happened to those who were with him during his whole career of prophethood? I guess they were still with him. The answer is Quran. It was revealed in stages, precisely in response to situations, and every verse, not all, listen hyperbole, were received in front of by witnesses for particular instance. They weren't witnesses to the events themselves. Those things were being told to them, and they memorized it. But since only Muhammad received this verse and only few of his followers would have followed him, they had to consult each other to know totality of Muhammad's verses. Muhammad would then personally check whether or not someone is adding or subtracting words from the family or Allah. Okay, where does he get this information? None of it is story dictated by Muhammad. If it's Muhammad dictating it to his followers, yes, it is. The reason why there are a few miracles attributed to Muhammad is that, according to Muhammad, his main spreading his message. Only reason why even his miracle is mentioned was to show that believers are completely hopeless, that even such strong evidence is not good for them to believe possible. It doesn't chase anything. You're pointing out this particular miracle in the Quran. That's the point. And I'm telling you, it's not based on eyewitness testimony. Your arguments are just completely bogus. You're barking up the wrong tree here. See? All right. What is your main problem with Google Books? Why do you consider them unreliable? You think Google Books mislead people? No, I've already explained this. It says, well, if you can prove historically that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, like a miracle of resurrection, then that would be enough evidence to prove Jesus was indeed God. Why would that exactly prove it? Because let's say, for example, that Jesus never claimed to be God. Could God not have raised Jesus from the dead if he wanted to? Sure. Could God be distinct from Jesus when he raised Jesus from the dead? Yeah. Jesus' resurrection would not substantiate that he was God. I mean, unless, of course, he claimed to be God, and then, there goes resurrected from the dead. But even then, it just leads support to it. Again, I don't believe in adoptionism. I don't believe the early scholars believed he was deity simply because he rose again from the dead. That is a Bart Ehrman's view. I don't take that view. I honestly thought this was your position, but I'm now confused. Is this your position that you can prove this event historically, not theologically? I can prove it historically, but that concerns the resurrection. Okay, on the resurrection topic, based on what I've already told him, okay, there are certain things I can't prove historically, but I can prove historically that Jesus rose again from the dead because I can prove the event. Okay, can I prove that God raised Jesus from the dead? No, that takes an additional step that goes beyond what I can prove as a historian. Okay, it doesn't mean it can't be proven. It just means it would take an additional step going outside the bounds of normal historical methodology, because historians just don't have the tools to deal with that. But I can sit there and say, as a historian, the event itself took place. Just like I said, I couldn't prove that Jesus died for our sins historically because I don't have the tools to deal with that as a theological construct. If I can prove Jesus died by crucifixion, I can still prove the event. In the same way with the resurrection, I can still prove the event, even if I can't prove that God is the one who did it. Understand? All right. He says, I'm not Matt Dillahunty, like presuppositionalist. I know what will convince me of the supernatural, even if it's a specific religion. I'm glad that he's not like Matt Dillahunty, because I'm not so sure how Matt Dillahunty can ever be convinced of anything unless he wants to be convinced. Obviously, as I have made it abundantly clear that Bible itself is not good enough to prove Jesus is like rise from the dead. Yes, it is. You might assert that you haven't proven anything. Historically speaking, at least according to me, for many Christians, it is. But it is enough to prove the event historically. Yes, it is. It's very much. See, okay, different Christian apologists, different scholars argue on the resurrection differently. Jonathan McClattchie has his argument. I think in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, he did a maximum data case. His argument was an inductive argument. My argument is a deductive argument. All right. I argue from generalities to particulars. In this case, I argue from 7 facts that are strongly evidenced, and most scholars will take these facts as true. In most of them, almost all scholars will take them. A few of the facts, not almost all scholars take it, but most scholars will take it. The abundance of scholars will take it. But this information is not, these facts are not supernatural or inaccessible to the historian in any way. Each one of these facts can be accessed by the historian, and I have 7 of them. 7 facts, fact 1 through 7. And I put them in order, a succinct order as these events took place. And I show a number of evidence for each one of these facts. And when these facts are put together, they point logically to the conclusion that Jesus rose again from the dead. In a deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, because it logically follows from the premise. So the only way to disprove the conclusion is not so much to attack the conclusion as it is to attack the premises, which in this case, each premise is a fact. And so that's my argument. And so you can't prove it historically. I can't prove it that God raised Jesus from the dead. Not historically. I can prove it, but I can do it historically, because that's a theological construct, and it takes an additional step going outside of beyond the bounds of what I can prove as a historian. All right. Okay. Conclusion. He says he's forfeited his right to conclusion. He says he doesn't have that much to say. You see this right in his post. He said, "Okay, I won't be able to provide a conclusion per se. I don't, but I don't have anything much to add either. You should give your conclusion. I won't be replying to conclusion as we agreed." Okay. That said, thank you for the rebuttals. I will be present my conclusion tomorrow. Okay, I did, and he says, thank you. It was fun, and put in my conclusion. This is my conclusion. I know we have debated each other sharply, but I do not have any problems with you personally. I hope you know it. It is your arguments and your position that I am challenging, not your character. And I still hope, I still stand by that statement, by the way. As long as you're watching this, I still stand by that. And I am hoping you do distinguish the difference. Overall, I found your arguments to be weak and unconvincing. They were filled with logical fallacies, misrepresentations, and factual inaccuracies. I could also probably throw in some inconsistency as well. After all, he is trying to defend the Quran he doesn't even believe in. For many of the points you had presented, I saw that you offered no evidence for. You didn't. Quite often, you cite a scholar without evidence, and you end up committing the field authority fallacy. You tried to accuse me of this, but I presented evidence every time I cited a scholar. Sometimes the scholar I cite will present the evidence too. Your most common fallacy was the slippery slope fallacy, which it was, which you never really outright denied making, which he didn't. He comes close in his last rebuttal to deny making the slippery slope fallacy. It was the closest he ever came, but he never straight up outright denied it. Your most, in your race to try to prove a causal connection to escape this fallacy, you have tried numerous times to prove a double standard that didn't exist with me. In doing so, you've tried to contrast the Quran and the Bible, either claiming they were the same situation as far as the evidence is concerned, or even worse off. However, as we've debated back and forth, I have demonstrated from the Hadith literature that that wasn't the case. The Quran was made up of stories, if you want to call them verses, fine, but I don't see the difference. Before it was ever composed into a written version, after most of the ones that remembered it at the Battle of Yamama, where 70 of them died. The Quran was not based upon eyewitness testimony, and it has numerous factual inaccuracies, including both historical and scientific inaccuracies, which we covered. And it is 600 years after Jesus, its primary figure, in which it is about. Bringing the some 40 years after Muhammad is irrelevant because of how long after Jesus, which is referenced quite frequently. The Quran dates. We have, in contrast, an early creed found within 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 that we can trace through Paul to the very lips of the original eyewitnesses themselves. This creed dates within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion and blows anything we have from the cross straight out of the water. Paul believed in a bodily resurrection. I gave explicit reference to this, but these passages remain unanswered by you, which they did. I read the post to you. He never once dealt with these explicit references. Instead, he tried to use unclear references in Galatians 1:16, which he later, in many, it was kind of vague, to interpret the very clear references that I gave to validate what Paul believed. I wish we could have gone more into the case for the resurrection than we did, but I will be doing a debate review on YouTube, which is this. Also, by the way, understand I didn't throw this on him by surprise. I'm not trying to sucker punch him or sometime I'll sneak away dealing with his last rebuttals. Of course, in all fairness, he can make a debate review video too if he wants to on YouTube. I have no problem with that. But I did tell him that I was going to do this. About our debate, it has been good to debate you. Sorry we couldn't agree, but I had fun too. Just think on everything I presented in this debate, and maybe we can do this again sometime. I put the little 4 dots like that, saying, like maybe continue on at some point. And of course, I left it on a really, really positive way. And we did. We left it. He came back. Anuj Agarwal came back. Haha, same here. I really hoped we could, in fact, agree, but indeed it was fun, and I would love to do it again sometime. But next time, I would like to understand your position. It seems like either of us were talking past each other for at least some of the time and at least some of the issues. Have a nice day. And I put you too. We ended the debate really, really positive. Again, I had no personal problem with them, never have. I know we argue sharply. I know some of the arguments I had issues with, or actually all the arguments I had issues with, but that was an argumentation. And he seemed to resolve some things. I mean, he was willing to agree that the earliest followers of Jesus did accept that Jesus rose again from the dead. Okay, that's awesome. That's a starting point there, I would love to actually debate the resurrection of him. I mean, directly without all this accusation of double standard gunk. That just wasn't the case. And just to kind of give you, I know we're going back and forth, and sometimes that can get kind of confusing. But let me explain let me see, move my window here. Let me try to explain. Ultimately, he thought I had, and he assumed I, even though I explicitly told him I didn't, many times, and only toward the end of the debate that he finally got, oh, so he doesn't have this criteria, which I didn't. But he thought I had a criteria that Jesus' words were true, or that the Gospels were true because of miracle claims. And because of miracle claims, that's the criteria that I'm using to determine that. And he says, oh, well, that's a bogus criteria. Oh, I agree. That's why I don't use it. But you thought I had that criteria. And because he thought I had that criteria, he thought I had a double standard. Because if I believe the Bible, why won't I believe the Quran then? But the Quran don't have the same level of evidence as the New Testament, as the Bible. I almost feel sorry for the guy, really, because he's trying to sit there and prove a double standard that I don't have, because he's under the impression, or assumption, I should say, because he's assuming this, that I have a criteria for determining the reliability of the Gospels and Jesus as the Son of God, and whether he's trustworthy or not, on the basis of whether he's doing miracles or not. And, well, he says, well, miracles are being done in Quran, why don't you believe it? Well, one thing, it doesn't have the same kind of level of evidence, but that's one of the things that I really pounced on in this debate. And the second reason is because that's not my criteria. You're creating this bogus criteria. You're setting it there, and you're saying, and then you say that's a bad criteria to have. And I agree, it is. That's why I don't have that criteria. But you assume I had that criteria. You attack that criteria. You presume that criteria and judge me or judge the situation and determine that I must have it as double standard. Why don't I believe the Quran too? The Quran does not rise to the level of evidential proof as the New Testament does. Also, one of the things that didn't really come in this debate as much, in Islam, Islam's truthfulness is closely tied to the Quran and to the alleged revelation that Muhammad got from Gabriel. So, if the Quran is false, all Islam falls apart. This is not how Christianity is. If somehow one day we find out the Bible is false, let's say if we find out the New Testament is all just bunk, say we can demonstrate reliably that the Gospels made up these old traditions, there's no evidence force behind it, and the evidence wasn't as good as we thought it was for the Bible. Jesus still is in the dead. Christianity is still here. See, Christianity doesn't rise or fall with whether the Bible is true or not, but it does rise and fall with the resurrection. And that's why it's important. I would like, if we and him do debate again, I wouldn't mind us debating the actual resurrection of Jesus Christ without all of this double standard gunk that I kept dogging the whole way because he kept trying to accuse me of it, and that's one thing. The Quran, but in comparison to the Bible, the Quran is 600 years after Jesus. How long it dates after its founder is irrelevant. It's relevant. It's how long it dates after the facts. And it's 600 years removed. All right. The Quran has very little miracles in it. And the ones that are pieced together as verses with the rest of the Quran. Based on what was dictated to Muhammad, based on what Muhammad dictated to his earliest followers. Most of them died in the Battle of Yamama. So this Quran had to be composed after Muhammad's death. It's got historical and scientific inaccuracies, which we talked about, as I mentioned in my conclusion. It just doesn't rise to the same level of evidential proof as the Bible. I mean, that's just a simple fact of the matter. And Anuj, if you're watching this, Anuj of India, I hope you hear my heart. I hope you hear my plea. My prayer is for you to come to Christ, to know Jesus, to have him transform you like he's transformed me, and understand something. I mean, we can know all this cognitive. I know a lot of facts about the New Testament. And it's because of what I know that fills me with confidence that I can trust the Bible, I can trust Christianity, I can trust the facts that Jesus did indeed rise again from the dead. But when it comes to a relationship with Christ, that takes another step forward. Because, see, it's not just about what I know. It's about whether I have a relationship with him who died for my sins, who rose again from the dead, who is now the Lord of my life. And I want him to be the Lord of your life. I want him to transform you. I want him to change you. Ultimately, Christianity, it is awesome. It's got more evidence backing it than any other faith system. But it's more than just the evidence. It is more than just the facts. It is more than just knowing a bunch of cognitive information about a religion. It's about knowing that Jesus loved me enough to die for me on the cross, and he changed my life. He came into my heart. He came into my life. He came into my world, and he just transformed me. And he's transformed lots of other people too. And I don't want you to miss the truth simply because you are so convinced that it cannot be true because one day you decide you didn't think it was evidence for it. Well, maybe you need to reconsider. Maybe you need to reconsider. I'm glad if y'all went through this debate review video with me. I do appreciate it. But at any rate, it has to eventually come to an end, and so this debate review. And also the next one, I'm gonna try to see if I can get past the technical difficulties and see if I can produce the debate review that I did between Dr. Jonathan McClattchie and Matt Dillahunty, and release that to the internet, to YouTube. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm trying to build a YouTube channel up. I'm going to have a lot more apologetic videos like this. Yeah, please let me know in the comment section what you think of the video. And I'll see you on the next
one. I guess we reached the end to this YouTube series on my debate review with my debate with Anuj Agarwal from India, YouTuber Anuj Agarwal from India. I hope you enjoyed this debate review. Mostly, the reason you probably wonder why I did a debate review on a debate I did with someone in the comment section of a video. Typically that's not how most people do debate reviews. It's most typically it's unlike most people do debates. But I thought that the information, because we went back and forth for over 2 weeks, we had 220 posts between us, and a lot of the stuff we went back and forth, we're going back and forth, and the information that the was beneficiary to somebody that's listening to this debate review. And I knew that ultimately, because of all the different various topics that we covered the biographies, we covered, I presented evidence that the Gospels were ancient biographies. I presented evidence that Apostolic was not an ancient biography, but even if it was beyond living memory. I presented all this. The You got to hear some of the evidence for the Bible and the Gospels. You got to hear some of the evidence for the resurrection, which I thought was really good. I could at least try to sneak that in there into the debate, because he was really obsessed with trying to prove a double standard that I didn't have. Um, I want to. My eighth part wasn't very long, and I wanted to basically do a closing video that would close out this whole debate series on that I'm doing on Anuj Agarwal, the debate review that I had on the debate that I had with Anuj Agarwal, and I wrote some highlights down to the debate, basically, and basically it has to do with my evaluation of the debate and what I thought and that sort of thing. Um, the first one is the obvious one, double standard accusation. This is the one that he did throughout the entire debate. And I kept trying to tell him I don't have a double standard. What he did was he assumed, in spite of the fact that I explicitly told him that was not the case, that my criteria for determining authenticity of Christianity, the Bible, Jesus' resurrection, things like that, on the basis of whether Jesus did miracles or not in the Gospels. That is the criteria that he based it on. He didn't agree with that criteria, which neither do I, since I don't have it, but he assumed that I had that criteria. And because he assumed I had that criteria, and since the Quran has miracles in it, then by that criteria, which I don't have, I have to accept the Quran too. He said, "Why?" In fact, one place even asked, I think earlier in the debate, "Why aren't you a Muslim?" Well, because the evidence for the Quran is not very good at all, when the evidence for the Bible is extremely good. But that that would be uh, but the reason I don't accept the Quran because it doesn't rise to the same level of evidence as what we got from the New Testament and Christianity. And of course, I don't have a double standard. By the same standard I'm judging the Bible by is the same standard I am judging the Quran by. The difference is that the Bible is winning and the Quran is not. It is badly, sorely lacking. As a result, the evidence for the Bible is much stronger. Um, the Quran, 600 years after Jesus. Okay, Jesus is primary figure. It makes a lot of historical and scientific inaccuracies. Um, it is it is like I said, we can't trace it beyond the Uthmanic revision. Um, it's physically impossible to do that. I mean, it just doesn't rise to the same level of evidential proof. I mean, it denies one of the best attested facts about Jesus crucifixion. That's widely, highly evidenced and widely agreed upon among almost all scholars, including non-Christian scholars. All right, so I don't have a double standard. That's what he doesn't understand. The same standard by which I'm judging the Bible by is the same standard by which I'm judging the Quran by. All right, he talked about Paul and Jesus' physical resurrection. Well, I mentioned the physical resurrection. He thinks that Paul thought was a spiritual resurrection, and he used a passage which he later admitted sounded very vague to him. Because I told him this is a very vague passage. You can't interpret clear references, with unclear references. You have to interpret unclear references in light of clearer ones. And I gave him explicit references to what Paul thought of the bodily resurrection in two passages in chapter 8 of Romans. He never responded to. Um, and so Paul clearly believed in physical resurrection. And there are other passages too. We could throw in 1 Thessalonians 4. We could throw in 1 Corinthians 15 and references there where he specifically identifies, in fact, even connects the general resurrection in the world to the ancient or to Jesus' resurrection. The fact that that everybody in the ancient world, whether they agreed with the resurrection or denied it, understood what the resurrection meant. They knew what it meant for certain, that it was a coming back from death, a re-embodiment of the soul, that like death is somehow being reversed. No one ever thought, even though the term spiritual resurrection might appeal to a lot of people, especially people in the charismatic movement, but the reality is that the term spiritual resurrection would have been foreign to the context that Paul is speaking in. It would have been foreign. Nobody would have ever had any doubt what Paul was talking about when he said Jesus rose again from the dead. No one. So if he says Jesus rose again from the dead, he means bodily. And of course, we also know what the Pharisees believed on the general resurrection at the end of the world, that it was a physical event. We know that, and Paul used to be a Pharisee. So that's further corroboration of that, corroborating evidence. And of course, all these passages got looked over in favor of a vague reference, which he later admitted sounded vague to him. And the Greek word there in Galatians 1:16 was apocalyptis, and it's a reference to Revelation, but it had no reference to what Paul actually saw, or even if he's even talking about what he saw. And I don't even think he's talking about what he saw. I think he's more focused on the experience of it. Maybe he saw something spiritually significant in it or something. But clearly, Paul believed in a physical resurrection. as there's explicit references and referenced. I wish we had gone more into the resurrection. I mentioned that in my closing statement. I mentioned that during the debate review. I still mean it. I wish we went further into the resurrection. I'm hoping, if being honored to have another debate, that we can stay more focused on other things. I kept having to do hurdles around his accusations of double standards, and I don't have those double standards. I don't. I same standard by which I'm judging the Bible by, the same standards I judge the Quran by. But he kept accusing me of having double standards, and I kept having to correct him on it over and over and over again. If it wasn't for that, maybe we could have stayed a little bit more focused on the resurrection. But we kept getting thrown off, and this got us into a lot of side issues. The Gospels as ancient biographies. I provided evidence in 3 different posts for the Gospels as ancient biographies. He claimed I didn't provide it one time, but I did. I provided it. I drew your attention to it every single time I got to it. I'll say, look at this post, and I will specifically spell out the evidence that I gave. He said I didn't even do it once. The only way we can ever know if something is a particular genre is by comparing it to things that we already know is of that genre. So if we already know, for example, Plutarch's Life of Brutus is an ancient biography, then we can contrast it with that and other ancient biographies, Life of Cato and the life of the lives of the Caesars and things like that. We can contrast it to that and be able to see how the ancient world wrote biographies and contrast that with the Gospels, and that's what we did. And the Gospels have far more in common. I gave several lists of all these things that they have in common with them. But he assumed that the only reason that the shift in scholarship happened, that they just happened to believe, is because Richard Burge wrote a book one day called What Are the Gospels, and then everybody suddenly believed. Well, Richard Burge said so. We're not going to even bother looking at these things to see if he's even right. We're just going to assume that he's right just because Richard Burge said so. That's illogical. And it's not even true. It's not historically true. What Richard Burge's book did is it put scholars in a position where they would have to seriously take a look at the Gospels and consider it. Richard Burge pointed out we can't use miracles as an overriding factor. We cannot use miracles as an overriding factor because miracles does not override whether it is an ancient biography or not, because most ancient biographies have miracles in them. That was Richard Burge's contribution. When scholars realized that, because that was the main reason they wasn't accepting it as ancient biography at the time, because they had miracles in it. He put it, well, they believed in historical novels because they compare it. It's more like historical novel. No, it's because they had miracles in them. The reason why they thought that they were historical novels. But most biographies have miracles in them. So suddenly it become once scholars realized that the presence of miracles in the Gospels wasn't an overruling factor that would overrule them as biographies, then they began to see, okay, well, it has a lot more in common with Greco-Roman biographies. That's what caused that. All Richard Burge did was pointed that out, and scholars began to look at that. All right. We talked about the earliness of P52. I offered evidence, paleographical evidence, of the early date of P52, close to 8100, probably most likely before AD 125, although most scholars do land at AD 125. He says, well, you say all scholars. No, I didn't say all scholars. I said most do. you can always find someone to take an extreme position. Okay. Um, he cited scholars that weren't even scholars in the field of text criticism. I think he's got one was a Nongbre who had a degree in biblical studies. He had no degree in either text criticism or paleography. He said, "Well, yeah, but you cite Philip Comfort, and all he has is a degree in text criticism, or Kurt Allen, and all he has is a degree in text criticism. But they still have degrees in text criticism. Okay, textual criticism and paleography overlap one another because they both deal with manuscripts and they both deal with dating of manuscripts. And there are some people that have expertise in textual criticism, which also double in expertise in paleography. Not all of them. There's some that don't dabble with paleography at all, but there are some that do. Philip Comfort's one of those people that do. Maybe Carolyn is too. But either way, they still have degrees in textual criticism. Okay, that's the point. And P52 is exceptionally early. This idea of them dating 150 or 200, way too late for P52. Anyone who says that has never even seen the fragment. It is clearly early, really early. And there is no doubt in that at all. And this is one of the things why I think that almost all scholars, not because they all agree, but because of the evidence, I think almost all scholars, I'm in total agreement with almost all scholars today on the subject matter of P52 because the evidence is so strong that there's no doubt that it's an early fragment. For him to say otherwise, if he was a scholar, this would put him in the extreme position. Okay, a lot of his arguments has logical fallacies all throughout his arguments. That was clear. The most common one was the slippery slope fallacy because he kept on bringing up the double standards he thought I had and kept making the slippery slope. That became his most common fallacy. The second most common fallacy was almost neck and neck with the slippery slope, except he did the slippery slope more. Was appeals to authority fallacy. He often cited authorities and sources without ever presenting any evidence. My favorite part was when he sat there and said, when he talked about the preaching of the Gospels being concerned with preaching, he said, he said he proved it. When did he prove it? He didn't prove it once. He didn't provide any evidence of that. What he did was he cited scholars that agreed with him, and on top of that, I don't think any of those scholars actually said that they were concerned with preaching. I think they said that things like, that they were flexible in John 1. I agree with them being flexible. I never said they wasn't. But he never cited scholars, or even if he cited scholars, let's say he cited scholars that agreed with them on the preaching thing. You can always find some scholar somewhere that agrees with you. I mean, chances are somebody out there somewhere, no matter how extreme they may be, takes your position. But the question is, what does the evidence support? So I'm asking for evidence that the gospel writers were more concerned with preaching than they were with getting it right. And he cites some scholars that agree with him. None of his scholars that he cites any evidence. He don't cite any evidence. He just lists the scholars. And then he says he's proven it. No, you haven't proven it. To prove it, to demonstrate it, you have to present evidence. That's just the way the game goes. You have to present evidence. This is why when I was citing scholars, I was very careful to make sure I presented the evidence, or I would sit there and cite the scholar who has the evidence being presented in the quotation. I was very careful to make sure I did that. Why did I do that? Because I wanted to be able to show you that it's not really because my favorite scholar says this is the case, but whether because it is the case. He tries to accuse me in the debate. He tried to accuse me of only using apologetic sources. And only some of these guys were apologists. Only some of them. James White considers himself an apologist. Mike Licona considers himself an apologist, but he doesn't really usually call himself that. He usually calls himself a historian or a New Testament scholar. Um, uh, but most of the scholars, Dan Wallace, don't really consider himself a Christian apologist at all. He's a textual critic, a textual scholar. Same thing with Kurt Allen. They're textual scholars. And of course, James White is also a textual scholar, even though he does consider himself a Christian apologist. He dabbles in other stuff too. Um, he's kind of like me, almost. He tends to be a kind of a jack of all trades, where he does other uh, issues and talk on a wide variety of other topic matters. Um, for the most part. He's not quite like me. I mean, there are certain issues that he never even bothers with. Like I usually study things like the Age of Earth controversy and things like that, and I don't think I've even heard James White even speak about the issue on that. So there are some things he won't talk about, but very few of them were actually Christian apologists per se. But even then, I didn't quote them for their apologetic value or contribution. I quoted them for their scholarly contribution, because Michael Cohen was a historian, Kurt Allen and Dan Wallace and James White were textual scholars with degrees in those fields. That's the reason why I quoted them. I didn't quote them because they were my favorite Christian apologists. In fact, some of the people I quoted, like Bart Ehrman or Richard Carrier, these guys aren't even Christians. They're not even Christians. Therefore, they're definitely not Christian apologists. They're very much against the Bible and the New Testament. Richard Carrier is an atheist and a mythicist. Bart Ehrman's an atheist, sort of. You know, sometimes he's an atheist, sometimes he's agnostic. Depends on which day you catch him on. But either way, he's probably one of the most popular critics writing against the New Testament today. Definitely not on the side of the Bible. But yeah, he's agreeing to a lot of stuff that I was saying. Now, of course, I don't agree with Barman on everything, but I'm just saying, as far as citing sources and discussing that, you know, I cited a few non-Christian sources. I think I cited, at one point I cited Gerd Ludemann. So, yeah, but I wasn't citing Christian apologists, and even the ones that were Christian apologists, like James White, for example, I didn't cite them for their apologetic contribution. I cited them for their scholarly expertise in the matters that we were discussing. All right. Okay. We talked a little bit about his use of sources. You know his sources very questionable. Most of them come to the internet. I understand he's not like me. He's obviously not fully engaged into the subject matter to the point where he's buying books on the topic matter, and he's got bookshelves all the way around his room just to because have all these books and stuff like that, and have resources that I can look at. I don't have to rely on the internet. The problem, however, with relying on the internet is the internet is a mixture of both true and false information, and there's no truth filter on the internet. It's like I always tell people, the only truth filter on the internet is you. You're the only truth filter on the internet. You got to determine if it's true or not. You got to question sources. You've got to look up the information. You got to make sure that the information you've been told is correct, and things like that. Because there isn't anybody on the internet that's going to somehow zap you with an electric zapper if you get something wrong. Now, I usually do have a checklist if I do go through the internet, and I'm very cautious about what sources I accept. You know, websites which don't tell me their author and things like that. I don't know who wrote it, so I'm not going to use that information. I want to make sure that the person who wrote it is a reputable scholar. One of the things I like about Bible.org is that they typically have the information about their degrees and their area of expertise and things like that on the side, so you can actually see what their credentials are, and I like that. So I know if there's a scholar or something of that nature writing on that site, I can be able to look at their credentials and see if they know what they're talking about. News organizations are good because a lot of the major news organizations like CNN and things like that, they have fact checkers. They actually have people that's checking their information out to make sure they're correct. And so that makes them a little bit more reliable to me. I mean, it doesn't mean make them foolproof. It just makes them more reliable, knowing that they're trying to make sure that their information is indeed accurate and things like that. So I got like a long checklist of things. Now I don't usually recommend, especially if it's something of a serious nature. General information maybe be fine, but when it comes to something that you need to dig deeper, I usually don't recommend the internet. I recommend getting book literary sources, at least with published sources. You have the person writing a book that's out there for public review, and other people can respond to and say whether or not if the information is accurate or not, and that makes it more valuable to me. And that's why I often get book sources. Um, Relying heavily on the internet the way he did, a lot of the sites he cited were very questionable. Um, He eventually started citing scholars, which was good, except that he started doing it in the form of an appeal to authority fallacy, where he didn't cite any evidence at all and then assume he demonstrated something, and he didn't demonstrate anything because he didn't present any evidence for it. And that was not the point of making sure your information is coming from a reliable source. The idea is that one, you want to make sure your information is coming from a good source, that you can trust the source that the information is coming from. But second, you also want to make sure that the source provides information or any evidence, or you present the evidence and then you cite the sources to make the point about the evidence. But the object is that you don't treat your sources like they're infallible. And he kept treating his sources like they were infallible. All right. He had a number of factual inaccuracies in the. He came off, and throughout this debate, he even tried to, as if he's some sort of expert on the Quran, as he's some sort of expert on Islam. But it turns out there's a lot less information that he knew than he thought. For example, whenever I said the Hadith said rewrite the Quran, he said in Sahih al-Bukhari, he says, "Oh, where in Sahih al-Bukhari that does it ever say that rewrite the Quran?" I showed him. I mean, it specifically says rewrite the manuscript specifically, but the passage that actually talks about him or them when they reconstructed the manuscripts in the Uthmanic revision, because it was done in the context of the Uthmanic revision, that they were to rewrite the manuscripts. The idea was to come up with a version of the Quran which is unified, but it was likely going to be different from all of these different versions floating around. And we don't know if Uthman decided to change something, add a doctrine in, or whatnot. He said, "Oh, that would lead to war." It almost led to war before these Monic revision because of all these differences in the manuscript that was causing tremendous amount of disunity. That's what led to creating the Uthmanic revision, and it is physically impossible to get to the original Quran past the Uthmanic revision. We've got a few manuscripts that managed to escape the burning, but that's not enough to reconstruct the original text. You have to have lots of manuscripts to reconstruct the original text of any manuscript tradition. All right. His misapplication of theories or fact, which he conflates with facts. He thinks theories were flat facts. They weren't facts. A theory is a formulated hypothesis that might have some data, some experimentation, might have some. It might even have some evidence behind it. Okay, but it isn't fully demonstrated. If it was fact, if it was considered fact, it would be a law, not a theory. I showed him this in the debate. I showed the scientific method, the way the scientific method worked, and this went unanswered in the debate. He didn't even respond to what I said about the scientific method. All right. And the Quran has some serious scientific inaccuracies. I mentioned that the sun touching the earth, and of course he says, "Oh, well, that's in the context of the miracle of Fatima." Okay, well, assume that it has anything to do with the miracle. You've got the sun here, you got the earth here, and you got them coming close to each other. Okay, and then touching. Okay, one. Why doesn't the heat incinerate human beings on all over the planet Earth? You know, when the sun got that close, because sun wouldn't even have to touch the Earth before everybody on the planet Earth would have died from the heat. Two, why doesn't the gravity of the sun pull the Earth into the sun? Did the miracle somehow keep that from happening? Three, wouldn't the sun touching the physical Earth, wouldn't that cause the Earth to be incinerate? See, these are scientifically inaccuracies. Okay. And clearly it does. And of course, it has historical inaccuracies. I mentioned that. It denies Jesus' death by crucifixion, for example. Of course, it's 600 years removed from the life of Christ, so we shouldn't expect anything more than lots of historical inaccuracies. Okay, we talked about the word kahug in Hebrew for circle in Isaiah. It means vault or circular. It does not mean flat or flat disk. And you know something, he never once demonstrated it that it means that. What he did was he tried to sit there and show a translation, the King James. He links the translation to a King James version. He links a version to the King James version. All right. But the King James is a 1600 Anglican Bible version, archaic English. The King James translators were not very was better at Latin than they were at Greek and Hebrew. And of course, our knowledge of Greek and Hebrew has improved considerably since the 1600s. Anyhow, um, so and just because the King James translators translated certain passages other places in other contexts certain way doesn't mean that's how it's translated. I was going directly from the Hebrew, which is the original language that the Old Testament was written in, and it translates literally. Kahug translates literally vault. It's a reference to the vault of the heavens, but the object of it is that it's kind of like the horizon. It just kind of goes around the earth. The idea is that this is a circular shape. And of course, circle and a sphere are actually the same shape. They're just different dimensions. Circle is two-dimensional, sphere is three-dimensional, but they're the same shape, just different dimensions. Another way of thinking of it, circle is a two-dimensional sphere. Sphere is a three-dimensional circle. You know, that way. But clearly, the Bible is scientifically accurate. If you look at the Earth from space, it does look like a circle. He brings up like things like theory of evolution and Big Bang theory, but these aren't verifiable and falsifiable stuff. What I mean, you might really think it's true, but you can't verify it. You can't falsify it. It's nothing that you can observe. He tried to equate it to gravity, which is a false analogy fallacy. Gravity is a law, a law, not a theory. There's no such thing as a theory of gravity. It is the law of gravity. So that's a false analogy fallacy. A lot of times, a lot of old earthers do that. Not just evolutionists, not just atheists. But a lot of evolutionists do that. They'll equate it to like denying the Big Bang theory is like denying gravity, and when they're not even on the same plane as what we're talking about. The Big Bang, evolution, those are theories. Besides, even if I took the Big Bang, even if I took what little evidence they claim for the Big Bang theory, such as, let's say, the CMB, cosmic microwave background, which actually commits to affirming the consequence. Um, uh, and of course, if I were to take, but even if I took like some of the evidence, the Big Bang, like abundance of light elements and things like that, the Big Bang theory claims certain order, and which is what he was pouncing on, because he was saying the Bible's order is different from the Big Bang. I agree, it is, but that's because the Big Bang theory is wrong. But it has a different order. So, what evidence would you have for the Big Bang theory that shows that the order of the universe happened the way the Big Bang theory claims? Even if I were to concede to the Big Bang theory, there isn't any. It's just a theory that states that that this is the way the universe came into being. So, if you're going to show or demonstrate that the Bible is scientifically accurate, you're going to have to use something that is falsifiable, like the shape of the earth or something. You cannot sit there and use something like a theory of evolution or a Big Bang. You can't falsify it. Nobody was there when humans allegedly came from apes, or ape-like ancestor, or whatever you want to call it. Nobody was there when the Big Bang allegedly happened and the universe came into being. Um, so you can't falsify it. You can think it. You might think it all you want to. You might even think you have good reasons for thinking it, but you cannot prove it. You cannot demonstrate it. Therefore, you can't use it as proof that the Bible is scientifically inaccurate. Okay, his word or his need to make a assertions claimed that he had proven something when no evidence was ever demonstrated. He had a tendency to claim that he proved something. A lot of times that happened, like when you appeal to authority and then says he proved it, he didn't prove it. And he said, I made bombastic claims. He has a tendency to make bombastic claims. Oh, I proved that they were concerned with preaching, but yet all he did was cited scholars who agreed with him. He never demonstrated it. He never presented any evidence for it. A serious lack of evidence. Much of his arguments, he never even presented any evidence. And then some questionable sources, but a lot of stuff he didn't even present evidence. His claim is bias is self-refuting. He kept pounding on the bias thing at one point in the debate, and we went back and forth several times on that. But the reality of it is that his whole bias argument is self-refuting. Whether you think he's thinking they're lying, have inaccurate information, or even just unreliable. He says, "Oh, I'm just saying that they were unreliable." All right, it's still self-refuting. How do I know you're not unreliable? You're biased. You agreed that we're all biased. We agreed that we're both biased. Okay, then how do I know you're not lying about bias or unreliable regarding what you're saying about bias? See, that the whole argument is self-defeating. All right. This one's interesting. His need to borrow accusations that I made to him and apply them to me and place it in a way that was beyond what their intended use, such as affirming the consequent, as well as when I accuse them of straw manning. All right. In the case of the affirming the consequence, I put that in the context when I was talking to him about the Big Bang and the CMB. He places it in a completely other post about gospels and reliability and things like that, and says how does that not commit to affirming the consequence, as if he didn't really know what affirming the consequence actually says and what it actually is. and I don't even think he even looked the definition up to understanding it, or he doesn't fully understood it when he read the definition. And so I started trying to correct him on it and try to resolve it issue and try to tell him what I actually meant by it in the context. And he says, straw man, I don't really think that way because I don't think theories can really be falsified. Except it was in the context of when I was talking about the Big Bang Theory. And I was just simply trying to explain why I used the affirming consequence because of this reason. And you were using it in a completely inaccurate way in the other post. So he misrepresented me to accuse me of misrepresentation. He took me out of context, clearly. So I often found that interesting that he didn't start accusing me of strawmanning him until I started accusing him of strawmanning me. You notice that? When I brought up from the consequence, he brought up from the consequence. It's almost like he borrowed some of the accusations that I made on him and threw it back at me. Except I wasn't actually making them. And he misunderstood either my argument when I accused him of it, or he misunderstood the proper application of those fallacies. Also, I didn't mention this in my notes, but the bias argument also committed the circumstantial ad hominem. He tried to get out of that by saying, "Oh, well, it's an exception if it's lack of evidence." But testimony, he might. We didn't really get into this in the debate, but he might agree with Matt Dillahunty about testimonies or claims not counting as evidence. We didn't really talk about that much. Actually, we didn't talk about that at all. But testimony is a type of claim, but some types of claims, such as testimonies, can count as evidence. It doesn't guarantee that it's true in an absolute sense. It just provides support for it. He has some kind of distinction in when he thought about theories, that somehow theories is cannot be proven in an absolute sense. Therefore, he tries. I think it has to do with his epistemology, and therefore he seems to have this, like he'll say, CMB is support of the Big Bang, but he won't call it evidence for it. Maybe he thinks evidence means it's guaranteed, and his epistemology rejects the idea of something being guaranteed. I don't know. It seems that Matt Dillahunty had the same problem in his debate when he kept debating Jonathan McClattchie. He kept having the same issue where he thought if it's evidence, it's got to be guaranteed. If it's not guaranteed, then it can't be evidence. And that's just a flawed epistemological view. See, his misrepresentations, which was throughout the entire argument, with after I had been, even after I was being really explicit. This was true throughout his whole argument. And throughout the whole debate, he kept on misrepresenting me every step of the way, all the way to the last rebuttals. He was misrepresenting me. He even misrepresented. I mentioned that about the CMB and the affirming the consequence. I mean, saying in the reference to the Big Bang Theory, and then he started saying, and he used it in a different post that had nothing to do with that particular post. And so I sat there and tried to respond to that, and he took me out of context. He misrepresented me all the way up until his final rebuttals. So there was a constant misrepresentation. He even misrepresented me one time after citing me verbatim. And even in the verbatim, I said the Quran was composed by at least one person. At least. He must have, he had to have catch that. Because when he tried to cite me after that, I mean, he cited it verbatim. And then when he was responding to it, he put it in quotations. And the one in quotation did not have the words at least. This makes me think that he had caught it, but he didn't want to use it because he couldn't accuse me of making a straw man then, or having inaccurate information or something. But I said at least one person. even when I was being explicit, he misrepresented me. Okay. He focused on the dating of the Quran for Muhammad's lifetime, when this dating is rendered irrelevant by how far it dates after Jesus, its primary figure, and the fact that you cannot reconstruct the Quran past the Islamic revision. I already spoke about the last of that. The Islamic revision, you can't reconstruct it past that point. Anyhow, but how long it dates after the composition of Muhammad is completely irrelevant. At best, you could say that his alleged revelation from Gabriel was early enough to Quran. Okay, the revelation that the apostles gotten allegedly, that you think is just some kind of spiritual revelation, rather than them just because they actually witnessed the physical risen Christ. Also happened shortly after. The original eyewitnesses were the ones proclaiming it. They saw it. Okay? But then the question has to be, how long before they are witness to this event? Well, we have a creed within a few years. So, yeah, it's pretty early. With Muhammad, you have a work that's primarily about Jesus, but it's 600 years after he had lived. The fact that it dates only maybe, let's assume that his dating was correct, within 40 years of Muhammad's lifetime, is completely irrelevant. It dates 600 years after Jesus. That's the relevant point. All right. Okay, I already mentioned that one. His rolling tomb argument. His rolling tomb argument, we didn't go too far on this, but it was factually inaccurate, for one thing. I demonstrated that by showing that there was at least 4 tombs that predated AD 70. He tried to do that as evidence of AD 70 date, but he can't really. The dating of the Gospels at AD 70 by skeptics like liberals like Bart Ehrman and stuff like that is completely arbitrary or presuppositional. Like Jesus couldn't perform prophecy and he prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, that sort of thing. So it was very presuppositional. So either they're doing it presuppositionally or they're doing it arbitrarily, but they're not doing it evidentially. They're not doing it because there's evidence for it. So I challenged them on that, produced a single shred of evidence. I got evidence that it dates at least AD 65 or before. Okay, or no later than AD 65. I said, what evidence do you have that it dates AD 70? And he provides a rolling tomb argument, claiming it must date after AD 70 if they mention the rolling tomb. But there's 4 references to it. And so he ended up backtracking that or taking that back and saying, well, yeah, there are 4 tombs, but 3 out of the 4 are royalty. So that shows it's not historically accurate, which we wasn't even on the historical accuracy with that one. And I said, well, first of all, that doesn't prove it's historically inaccurate. If there's 4 tombs prior to 8070 and Mark just happened to mention a rolling tomb, that obviously isn't historically accurate. Secondly, like I said, it's an argument from silence. Not even a good one, but it's an argument from silence. I don't think there's any real good argument from silence, but this is definitely not a good one because it's not even true. We have 4 tombs located before AD 70, and there probably was more. We just don't have them. We haven't found them yet. We just don't know. So we can't say for certain. He tried to argue for sure, but you can't really argue for sure. All right. And he tried to justify his arguments with silence, of course. His MO with logical fallacies was either to deny making the logical fallacy or, well, actually, he had 3 MOs. 1, deny making the logical fallacy. 2, try to reverse it and to accuse me of the logical fallacy. Because, say, like, for example, when I accuse him of authority, oh, but you do that. You do that. No, I don't. I cite authorities with the evidence. I never cite authorities without the evidence. I might tell you where the conversation is among a large, among most scholars, and when I do, sometimes I'll tell you I'll disagree with the majority. Like I'll say most scholars would take P52, 8125, but I think it's probably closer to 8100. That tells you I'm not appealing to authority in the first place, because I'm actually saying I'm differing with most of them, because most of them would put it about 8125, and I put it before that. So that shows you I'm not appealing to the majority. I'm just telling you where the conversation is among scholars. But when I actually cited authorities, I present evidence, or the authorities I'm citing presented the evidence. But either way, the evidence was presented. I never once not presented evidence. I quoted directly from the hadith. I sat there and gave you paleographical evidence. I gave you evidence of contrasting biographies and why the Gospels represent the genre of Greco-Roman biographies. I gave you evidence, but you never once presented me evidence. So he had this habit of trying to reverse that. The third thing that he would do is justify it. And this is what he did with the argument of silence. He didn't deny making the argument of silence. He justified making it. He tried to justify it. And he did it in a lot of different colorful ways, but they all came up to the same. The reasoning is obviously flawed. There's always a possibility that more could exist. I mean, we lost a ton of sources from the ancient world. We don't know what those sources were there. And besides, if we rely heavily just on archaeology, think about it. Most stuff from ancient history, most things that we know from ancient history, about probably maybe 80, 85, possibly even 90% of everything that we know from ancient history comes from literary documentary sources. We don't have as much information from archaeology. And even when we do have archaeology, we don't have a lot of details unless we have some kind of inscription or something. So the vast majority of what we know about the past comes from documentary literary sources. Relying strictly on archaeology ain't going to work. And of course, this doesn't prove a date for Gospel of Mark past AD 70, because Mark mentions rolling tombs. Therefore, it wouldn't show past AD 70 because they had rolling tombs before that. And of course, the tomb would have been provided by Joseph of Arimathea on behalf of Jesus, and because he took care of the burial arrangements, so he would have provided the tomb. And Pharisees were well off in terms of money, so that was not really a problem. His need to late date the Gospels. He really wanted to date the layout. I mean, he would go beyond what most liberal scholars would even date the Gospels. He would go to like 1680 years removed. And that's actually above where most liberals are. Because most liberals will say within, and that includes all 4 Gospels, not just John, between 30 to 60 years of Jesus' lifetime. This is where almost all scholars would place themselves at. Almost all of them. Now, there are differences among conservatives. There's differences among liberals. They're not. It's hard to put everyone in a box, but almost all of them would say between 30 to 60 years. So him saying 60 to 80 was actually going above. I mean, it was actually taking the Gospels outside of the first century, really. So it was going above where most skeptics would be. It's interesting enough. But you would often assert that with no reason. I gave evidence, why, for example, I talked about what Irenaeus had said about Mark's gospel being written when Peter was still preaching in Rome and things like that. And I showed evidence of this, and I gave evidence for Peter being the eyewitness source behind Mark's gospel. Um, we talked about the Markan priority and Q hypothesis and things like that nature, and the objection of them cheating off each other is false, it's flawed. In any given case, let's move on. His assertion of the Quran as eyewitness testimony. He made this throughout his post. But that's just not the case. The Quran, in its entirety, its verses, were dictated to Muhammad from Angel Gabriel, allegedly. And then Muhammad, allegedly, dictated this to his earliest followers, according to the Hadith literature. And his earliest followers memorized this information. Most of them died at the Battle of Yamama, 70 of them. They tracked down later the ones that had memorized pieces of information, and they took it and reconstructed the Quran. There's very few miracles in the Quran, but the ones that are constructed, calling them and saying, okay, they're not the same stories, they're just verses. Okay, what's the difference? The verses of the Muhammad miracles were verses within the Quran, and this is what's being reconstructed. Okay? There was no eyewitness testimony. It's not based on eyewitness testimony. Even if the Quran was, we didn't really focus too much on this, but even if the Quran was based on eyewitness testimony, it would still be subject to evidence or subject to being challenged, just like any other piece of evidence. Okay? Even the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels is subject to being challenged. Okay, just because it's eyewitness does not necessarily mean it's beyond challenge. Was it early enough? Is eyewitnesses reliable? Do we have corroborations and things like that? I'm not saying that those things are required, but I'm just saying that they're helpful when demonstrating your position. And so, just even if it was eyewitness testimony, it would still be subject to being challenged. But either way, it's not based on eyewitness testimony. There's nothing eyewitness about the Quran. And remember, Islam is closely tied to the Quran. If the Quran falls apart, so does Islam. We didn't really discuss that in there, but I probably should have talked about it. Because with Christianity, that's not the case with the Bible. If the Bible was suddenly proven untrue tomorrow, Christianity would still be true because Jesus rose again from the dead. The evidence for Jesus' resurrection is so strong that I usually propose a case of seven facts, which I think is strongly evidenced. All right. I can prove these seven facts, even if everything else in the Gospels were false, even if everything else in the New Testament was false, even if everything else in the rest of the Bible was false and untrue. Even if Matt Dillahunty was right and the Bible's a storybook whose veracity cannot be verified, that's what he said in his debate with Mike Winger. Even if that was true, Jesus is still risen again from the dead, and therefore Christianity is true. Christianity's truthfulness is not tied to the Bible. For one thing, the only thing the apostles had was the Old Testament. That's all they had at the time. The Septuagint of the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament. They didn't have the New Testament because it hadn't been written yet. The Gospels hadn't been written yet. So, yeah. So that's a huge difference between us and Islam. I can show Islam false just by proving the Quran false. You cannot show Christianity is false, even if you could demonstrate the Bible is false. And that's what I kept trying to tell him. All right. He obviously gave a faulty history of the Quran. It was mixed with some truth, but it was also very inaccurate. I think he probably got his information from Muslims, maybe when he went to research the Quran. I don't know. He seemed to make the false allegation that it was based on eyewitness testimony, which he could not. He never did once demonstrate its truth. I kept asking questions like, well, is it based on eyewitness testimony? Okay, who were these eyewitnesses? Who were these pagans that were talking? Who verified that it was who's writing? Who saw the events take place? Who were these eyewitnesses? I could tell you what the earliest eyewitnesses in the New Testament were. I could talk about the 12 disciples. I could talk about Peter. I could talk about evidence for their existence. I could talk about the gospel authorship, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I can talk about the evidence, external sources who wrote the gospels. I can testify. I can show you external evidence of Peter being the eyewitness testimony behind Mark's gospel. I can show you evidence internally, indirect evidence in Mark's gospel, where it's done from the Peter's perspective. For the most part, from Peter's perspective, the Petros perspective in Mark's gospel. I can show you those things. Who were these eyewitnesses that witnessed these miracles, allegedly, in the Quran? Who are they? There's no evidence for it. He often claimed it, asserted it constantly, never proved it. All right. He kept conflating historical novels with ancient biographies, which wasn't the same. That was a constant thing. When we were on the biography subject, he kept conflating historical novels with ancient biographies. Oh, well, ancient biographies are loaded with myth and fiction. That's not true. He mentioned the Romulus one by Plutarch. This is one that was written hundreds or many hundreds of years after it happened. Okay, so and Plutarch said, and it really wasn't because he was mixing myth and fiction. What it was is he's relying on sources that have legendary development in them, and he says that in his works, in his published works, he says that the sources that were further removed from his own lifetime, he didn't trust them. He didn't think he had very good sources. When it came to sources closer to his own time, he said he could trust them. He thought he had more reliable sources. So yeah, and of course, Plutarch wrote biographies stretching over hundreds of years to all the way to near contemporaneous ones to himself. And a lot of people forget that because we have like 50 extant biographies. There were biographies that he wrote that we don't have no more, but we have 50 extant biographies, about 50 of them, still in existence today. Yep. He says, oh, lost my place. Sorry. His constant assertion that the Philostratus' Life of Apollonius of Tyana was an ancient biography but was in fact a historical novel. I gave him evidence that it was a historical novel, and he came back. Well, there's some people that agree with me. Burge even agreed with me. Burge was writing a long time ago, but okay. So what? What evidence do you have that it's a ancient biography? Craig Keener talked about evidence. He talked about the length, that it was all wrong, that it mixes fact and myth, which is actually what historical novels did. And I challenged him on this. I asked him, okay, how would you tell the difference between a historical novel and an ancient biography if what you say is true, that ancient biographies mix myth and history? He never once replied to that. He never responded to that difference. He never told me how he could tell the difference, because historical novels were a genre at that time, and this is what historical novels did. And either he thinks that he's either conflating historical novels and ancient biographies, which is what I think he's doing, or he's trying to argue that they overlap, which they don't. Historical biographies overlap with historiographies. They don't overlap with historical novels. Historical novels might have some biographic conventions, and Apollonius Tyana does, obviously, but it's by and large clearly a historical novel. And even if it was an ancient biography, and I told him this too, it would be beyond living memory. And therefore, it's way beyond the scope of being able to know if it's even accurate regarding his life, or how much of it is accurate. It's dated to the early 3rd century. He tried to claim later that because he originally agreed with me that it was beyond living memory, but then he reverted back from that after reading a post. Oh well, Babylon's Tiana is contemporaneous with Jesus, and Damas, one of his disciples, which he called somebody else. That's enough factual inaccuracy. I have no idea who that person was that he named. He never told me. But Damas was his disciple, and he lived around the same time as Joshua John. Okay, that's true. How does that mean Philostratus works in living memory? It doesn't. Philostratus isn't writing in 1st century. He isn't writing close to 1st century. He is writing early 3rd century. Early to the mid 3rd century. Early to mid 3rd century. Which means he is writing over 100 years after Babylonian Tiana lived. He is not writing within living memory. Arguing that he does is huge statement that needs to be backed up. Says, okay. It says his false claim that the Gospels were more concerned with preaching than with getting it historically right, but never proving nor demonstrating this with evidence. He constantly said that the disciples or the Gospels were concerned with just preaching more than getting it right, and therefore we didn't know how historically reliable it can be because they were so concerned with preaching. I said, what evidence you have that was they were so concerned with that they couldn't get it right? What evidence you have? He never presented any evidence. I've challenged them several times throughout the debate. You saw that. I challenged them. Show me the evidence. What he did instead is he cited sources that did not present any evidence themselves either, that agree with him, that made the same assertion or similar assertions, or sometimes their assertion was something else entirely, not even over preaching, but they might be over like whether they were concerned with a moral character or person or something of that nature. Okay, or if they were flexible, which I agree with them being flexible, and I agree with them emphasis on moral character of a person. The issue, however, is because what he's saying is that they could not be right, accurate, or we don't know if they're reliable or not, or he's even asserting that maybe they're unreliable because of it. The problem, however, is that he has to demonstrate that that's the case. He can't just simply assert it. And so, what evidence does he have that they're just concerned with preaching and not with getting it right? He never presented any evidence. But after he presented what those few people that he quoted, he thought agreed with him on the preaching. A lot of them probably didn't even mention the preaching. I have to go back and look at it to be sure, but I don't think that a lot of them even mentioned preaching anyhow. But he said, well, I proved they were just concerned with preaching. When did he ever prove it? When did he demonstrate it? I went through the evidence with you. I went through the arguments. When did he ever present any evidence that they were more concerned with preaching than getting it right? He never once did. Never once. That was a constant theme, just assuming that he proved something when he cited his favorite scholar that agrees with him, rather than presenting evidence. That's why he committed the pill authority fallacy. He presented the scholar's claim as evidence rather than dealt with whether or not, if it was true or not on the basis of the actual evidence. And he did not present that. All right, let's talk about some positive notes here in the debate. There were a few things that we end up agreeing on. He eventually agreed that there were tombs for example, before 80, 70. In the next post, he agreed that the reference in Galatians 1:16 was vague because he said it seemed vague to him too. We agreed that he said that if you're saying that the earliest Christians believed that Jesus rose again from dead, I can accept that. That's what he said, basically. And so we had some agreements. I did make some leeway. It wasn't a total bust. He wasn't. One of the things that I liked about him is that he wasn't like Anuj wasn't like Matt Dillahunty. Even though he appears to be a supporter of Matt Dillahunty, he wasn't. He didn't argue like him. He was willing to engage. Um, Matt Dillahunty won't engage the evidence. He won't engage the arguments. He just dismisses them haphazardly because he doesn't agree with them. So he dismisses them. Oh, it's from the Bible, so I'm dismissing it. This guy didn't do that. It would have probably got on my nerves if he did. But he didn't do that. He's willing to accept, for example, that Paul wrote those 7 epistles, the undisputed epistles of Paul. He recognized that. He never once challenged whether Paul wrote those epistles. So I was able to cite from 1 Corinthians and Romans and Galatians freely without him ever challenging whether Paul really wrote that. He had no doubt that he did. I mean, they're among the undisputed epistles, but it's not the way Matt would have argued it. Obviously, Matt Dillahunty would have argued that he doesn't have no way of investigating it, even though we do. He would argue that he doesn't think it can be proven or demonstrated, even though it can. And this guy seems to be different. His epistemology is similar to Matt's in the whole absolute area, but at the same time, he's willing to look at the evidence. He's willing to throw up arguments. He's willing to engage with what the other person says without just haphazardly dismissing it. There might have been some dismissals on his part, but for the most part, he was very much engaged with the evidence or engaged with the arguments. I don't care if you have a really bad argument you throw at me. Okay, as long as you're dealing with what I'm throwing at you. If you're just simply dismissing it because you don't agree with it, the way Matt Dillahunty does, that is a pet peeve of mine. Don't do that. I want you to engage. You do us no good by not engaging what I'm talking to you about or arguing about. You don't do no good with that. We ended the debate positively. We wish each other the best. I understand something. I'm going to reiterate a point that I made in my conclusion. It's nothing personal. Okay? I have no personal problem with Anuj Agarwal. I don't want you spamming him and saying, how dare you have such terrible arguments in your debate with Brian Bowen. Don't do any of that. Okay? Understand that we had a debate, and we argue sharply for our positions. Okay? But I have nothing personal against him. My attacks was on his argument, the way in which he argues, and I think that this information is very beneficial for people. That's the reason why I'm doing this debate review. It isn't to hound Anuj and say, look how smart I am, look how dumb you are because you argue this way. That wasn't the point of it. In fact, I don't think he's a dumb guy at all. Actually, the point of it was so that people can be blessed with this kind of information and interaction between someone who's a Christian and someone who's a naturalist, and going back and forth on the YouTube and the internet, and be able to dialogue with each other freely like this, because you don't always see this in debates, because usually just time, just you got your word, you got this word, you got and the only interaction you see them doing is during the crossfire section, if the debate even has one. Some debates don't have a crossfire section. But me and Anuj were able to freely communicate with each other, going back and forth constantly, asking questions, presenting arguments, citing sources, things like that. And so I think that this would be very helpful to people watching these videos. And so I really recommend you watch all the videos. If you haven't watched it, some people might just jump in midway or something. Watch the videos from first video to last video. Okay, watch all 8 parts. You'll be blessed with it. But also understand something. Anuj Agarwal from India, if you are watching this debate review, it is my wish, it is my plea that you reconsider the evidence for Christianity, which far outstrips anything else of any other belief system I've ever seen. And if you said you're truly not like Matt Dillahunty, that you're willing to be convinced, that you're willing to be convinced by evidence, well, then look at the evidence. Look at the evidence and reconsider it. I will be praying for you. I don't want anybody in the comment section to talk harshly about you. That's not the point of this debate review. That is not the point of why I'm presenting this. I want people to be blessed with this information, but I also want you, Anuj, to change your mind. And I will pray for you because I really would like that. And I really had fun doing the debate. I told him this as well. I had fun debating him. I had fun doing this debate review even. I had fun going back and forth. And I learned a few things along the lines. I'm not saying I didn't learn a few things from Anuj. I mean, there was a couple of things I learned from Anuj. But it was very it was very good. It was very beneficiary, and I think other people will be blessed with it as well. Please do not forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I plan on putting up a lot more apologetic content. If I can, I'm going to try to put out something every single week. That's my goal. That's my plan because I want to build up my YouTube channel. I want people to subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to like it. That helps with the YouTube algorithm. It puts it further up the top and makes it more visible for people who are looking for this kind of content. And I want people to be able to benefit from it as well. Not just you personally if you're watching this video, but for other people to benefit from it. And they can benefit from it by liking this video. Please subscribe to my channel because that will allow you to get up-to-date information when I post other apologetic videos. I plan on doing a lot more apologetic videos. I plan on doing other debate reviews even. There's one on Jonathan McClattchie and Matt Dillahunty's debate that I had done, but I ran into some technical difficulties. So I'm because my video was way too long because I did a debate review and commentary on the entire debate. Now I know how all this works, and there's even though I'm verified with YouTube and I can do more than 15-minute videos, I still can't do. There's still a maximum of what you can do, and the debate itself was over 2.5 hours long. So my debate review, because I'm constantly stopping and commenting and talking about these things and quoting sources and things like that, was a much longer. And so I couldn't fit it on YouTube, and then I couldn't. And I guess I didn't save it to my editing program, and so I'm stuck with either reassembling the portions of the video that I put and edit them back together, or I can just redo the whole thing. And I'm thinking about just redoing it and just doing it in smaller portions. I do have permission, of course, from James Coons of Modern Day Debate to do that debate review video. So I still want to do it. But I also want to do some other apologetic content. I'm working on something now, a PowerPoint presentation concerning my argument on the historical approach to Jesus' resurrection. It's an argument that takes a middle ground approach between the minimalistic facts approach and the maximum data approach. And so I think that would be interesting and beneficiary to other viewers as well. So, but please like and subscribe my channel so you can get more apologetic content, so you can get this information in this particular video out there to other people for them to hear. All right. Thank you, and have a blessed day.